When the butterfly showed up on the wall, nobody in Bellweather suspected it was an invitation. I moved to Bellweather because my mother's house came with the town's cold blessing. Polite neighbors, a mailbox that needed sorting, an empty room that smelled like mothballs and lemon cleaner. The house sat on a slope that gave a view of the harbor. At dusk, gulls laced themselves against a sky the color of old paper. People here did not ask many questions. They kept appointments, paid for coffee at the diner with exact change, and let you tuck your grief away like a coat in a closet. I had been wearing that coat for a long time. I teach when they need a substitute. I broker small favors for principals and pastors, and I sit on local committees the way one warms a chair. In a town like Bellweather, there's work to be had if you know how to make your hands useful and your face neutral. The art show was one of those civil rituals. Once a year, the church hall filled with folding chairs and casseroles brought in Pyrex, and the most earnest people in town hung pictures on beige walls. They called it community. It had the look of something trying not to be lonely. I was asked to be a judge the year the butterfly came. They didn't ask because I was an artist. My own attempts at painting looked like maps of indecision. But because I was new and polite and could appear impartial when people wanted me to be. They gave me a clipboard and a pen that clicked like a nervous metronome. They fed me coffee that tasted of sugar and civic obligation. The painting was on a blank span of wall at the back, hung between a landscape of cut hay and a watercolor of the harbor. At first you didn't see it as a painting. You saw the space it refused to occupy. A white canvas that might as well have been a sheet hung to dry, if not for that one impossibility at its center. A wing. Blue, but not the blue of a bushel of things. It had a skin to it, the way oil paint builds a surface and begins to feel like something you could touch and find warm. The wings were edged in something that suggested bone or lace. They were feathered, but not bird-like, edged like carvings. It was painted with such meticulous reverence that some in the room swallowed like they were trying to quiet an error in their chests. They called it a butterfly because the shape suggested that word. But to call it that was to miss the thing's privacy. It sat in the way a person might sit very still in a chair and hold the room. People stepped closer, as if proximity might unlock a secret. Someone in the back, Mona from the bakery, who always kept her ring finger raw from kneading, put her hand to the canvas and did not scream. She closed her eyes and held the breath, as if that breath itself might be a piece to fit back into her rib cage. I watched. I couldn't tell if my face looked like I was both brave and unsurprised. The clipboard in my hand made me look appointed, not touched. Alice was standing beside me. She was thin as a photograph and had the hesitation of someone who expects to be forgiven for being small. She was 16 or thereabouts and had the kind of hands that read like a map of other people's labor, calloused in places that shouldn't be, tender in others. She put her palm near the painting and then withdrew it, and when she spoke, it was under her breath, like a prayer misdelivered. I didn't know it could feel like this. Her voice broke in the middle of the sentence, the way a lake gives way around ice. That line, awkward, private, hung between us. People around us were trembling. Someone wept quietly. I checked the clipboard, as if to find the part that would tell me how to judge someone who had hanged themselves on beauty. If you are the kind of person who reads stories for the slow burn, if you think some things happen and then we all return to our plates, subscribe and stay. There is no thunderclap yet, only the soft susurrus of a town unbolting itself. After that night, Bellweather trembled like an old house coming loose from its hewn place. The change did not arrive with banners or proclamations. It arrived like a light that had been under a bowl, and someone finally decided to lift the bowl. People stopped holding their wallets like shields. Hutchins at the hardware store placed a half-used bag of nails on someone's porch, and then came in to ask the person about their mother, as if the two were the same thing. The mayor began to leave notes on windows. "We do breakfast now. All welcome." Jacob, who had the face of a man who could be trusted to fetch your mail and never ask questions, found a laugh that sounded unused, like a voice that had been kept in a drawer. He began to linger at the diner with a cup cooling between his hands, and his eyes would find people he had known a lifetime and hold them there like maps he wanted to memorize. There were reconciliations that would have been gentle even if they had been awkward. Two neighbors who had argued over a fence for 10 years came together with a basket of peaches and told someone watching, me at my window, that they had been stupid. They held each other's gaze in public, and both seemed surprised at the comfort of it. Mrs. Laurie, the widow from Maple Street with her hair always pinned back, in a way that said she would rather hold grief the way one holds a bird, began to sit on her porch at dusk and hum low songs that sounded like chains being unlocked. She cracked jokes in line at the post office. People left candles in windows with notes like small confessions. "We were wrong about Sam. I drove past the lake for you." The town softened without pressure, like butter left in sunlight. I watched these things with the same hands that had packed my mother's closet. I had performed grief in ways that were small and private, an efficient attendance at funerals, a few letters that refused to be sent, and I found the town's new habit was not for me. When friends met with the strange urgency of people whose lives had been nudged by something gentle and inexorable, I felt something like contempt, and then, beneath it, a hollow that resisted being filled. Maya looked at me over coffee the morning after the show. She had been my student once. She had an old bruise of anger in her voice, tenderer now, and she said, "You never learned to ache, did you?" It was not an accusation so much as a diagnosis. I told her she was being melodramatic, and she smiled in a way that suggested she had been waiting for me to say that. She kept the old burn in her eyes, but somewhere behind it was compassion, strange and dangerous. Mrs. Laurie was the only one who seemed able to explain, in a way that made me gristle and agree at the same time. She called me one afternoon and asked me to come by. She had the habit of speaking as if sentences were objects she might lay between us, steady, exact. She gave me tea that tasted of thyme and dust. We sat on her sagging couch. Her fingers were lily-thin, and when she spoke, she looked at the seam of the carpet, the way people look at doorways they must cross. "It finds what still aches," she said, and I remember the phrasing, because it was not generous. There was no comfort in it. There was only the cruel, clear logic of a thermometer reading what was already there. "It finds what still aches," she repeated, and she folded her hands as if offering me a simple arithmetic problem. "I don't get to be found then," I said, mostly to be clever. I wanted her to tell me it had overlooked me by mistake, that perhaps it had misread my numbness as strength. She smiled, but the smile was quickened by pity. "You could have been found," she said. "There are people in this town who have spent their lives making holes for it. You kept your windows shut." When the weeks went on, the town's softening took on ritual. It was not organized. It had the simple contagiousness of a story. At dusk, people went out and walked in pairs with candles. They hummed at night in the old field behind the elementary school. They left notes on the church steps that were poetry and apologies wrapped together. Jacob began to tape small paper butterflies to the inside of his car window and drove slowly on country roads, as if the motion might stitch something together. The Whitcomb boys who had once caused trouble for sport, took to sitting on the curb and passing a bottle of sparkling water back and forth, while they talked about old regrets they had not known how to speak. There were exceptions, characters who did not soften. Nathan, the postmaster, remained a man for whom rigid hours and a ledger were a shelter. He continued to move about the post office like a man in armor. He answered questions with too much specificity, a kind of precision that suggested he was not yet willing to risk being seen differently. He would leave the building at dusk, and walk a circuit of the town without slowing down. The man in the Buick, the one who always polished the chrome as if that would teach him discipline, retained his muteness like a ruling principle. They moved around the townspeople who were blooming as if they were pre-existing definitions that could not be altered by light. Alice, though, was an early convert, and also in her conversion, a revelation. She waited at the canvas, as if waiting to be admitted to something. She began to speak to people in tones that were not command nor request, but the kind you use to tell someone you love them unexpectedly. She hugged the librarian, and the librarian cried, and then laughed like a low bell. Alice would sit in the churchyard and braid threads she said were for the moon. Once she looked at me with the kind of embarrassment someone has when they realize they've been chosen to hold another person's secret. "I feel full," she told me once, and then looked away, as if the fullness might frighten me. I tried to approach it the way I had been trained to approach odd phenomena, with distance, with hospital-smelling objectivity. I took notes. I asked the sheriff for any unusual reports. He made coffee for me and told me, with the same softness he used with his children, that he had never been happier to have nothing to report. The mayor shrugged and said, "It isn't my place to stop people from being happy." The town's clergy passed around explanations like pamphlets that were needed for background, but insufficient. The conversation grew circular and kind. Explanations were metaphors, and metaphors were permitted unless they became prescriptions. At night, when the town hummed and gathered, I found myself outside their circles more often than in them. That was perhaps my fault more than anything else. I had a talent for thinking a feeling away by naming it. Names are useful illusions. Have you noticed how calling a thing makes it look less like a threat and more like furniture? But names do not open chests. I watched couples walk through the dark with hands like magnets. I watched Mrs. Laurie stand with her eyes closed, as if she were testing the air, and once, when I looked at her, she nodded as if sharing a map. "It will not come like thunder," she said to me once. "It comes in pulses. It is patient." One evening I followed Jacob for no noble reason. He had begun to move with a care in his step that made him look like a man learning to dance. He was bright and soft, and lit up in ways that left me dull and sharp. He walked to a small park, where a ring of people sat on blankets and hummed. He noticed me, and offered a seat with a generosity that felt like a reproach. "Sit," he said. "You can sit." I sat. It was a mistake born of curiosity, and a private wanting to know if my bones were as hollow as my mouth feared. People sat and hummed. They hummed low, such that the sound vibrated through the ground, and made the grass look like it had thought about standing taller. There was the smell of wood smoke, and something sweet, like the underlayer of peach jam. Someone draped a blanket over an old lamp, and it cast a soft, breathing light like a heart. The group did not look at one another the way relatives do when they've rehearsed a face. They looked at one another the way people look when they've been given a new map and are amazed to see familiar streets on the page. I left before the night got earnest. I went back to my house with a new weight of observation. I told myself that this was simply contagion, goodness catching as a social virus, something that would burn through and leave behind a better version of the town. But then I remembered how Mona had pressed her palm to the canvas without making a sound. I remembered Alice's voice and the way it had shivered. "It finds what still aches," Mrs. Laurie had said, and the phrase kept hitting me like a bell. Why would it not find me? I asked myself that in the manner of someone practicing to be brave. If ache was eligibility, then what harm came of being eligible? The harm came, I suspected, from the thing I refused to name. That ache, the opening of a cavity in you that allows tenderness to be felt, is the very thing that makes you breakable. To be found would mean to be undone. The townspeople who softened did not seem to begrudge the undoing. They seemed relieved by it, the way a long-needed rain relieves heat. They kept returning to the field, to the humming, to the slow exchanges of the night, as if those were practices that loosened the knots in a rope. I tried to replicate it on my own terms. If the painting found what ailed people, perhaps I could manufacture an ache, perform it, arrange it as an actor might feign sorrow. I left flowers on porches, like a contrite phantom. I brought casseroles to those who had argued and tried to apologize for things I had not done. I practiced saying I'm sorry in front of the mirror until my mouth tasted of metal. Nothing seemed to change me. The gestures came and left the way. A costume is worn and then folded away. They did not sink into me. Maya saw the attempts for what they were. She said once, in an offhand way, "You store things like a banker stores money, calculating, guarded." There was a challenge in her voice, but she was not unkind. There are things you keep thinking you can retrieve. Ache doesn't work like that. I wanted to be angry at the honesty of the line, but instead I was embarrassed. There is a special sort of shame in being loved or observed and finding your own hands empty when you reach for what you thought would fill you. We began to notice small symbolic things. People started to leave patterns in public spaces, spirals carved into the bark of the old sycamore, circles made of small stones outside doors, a line of salt on a windowsill that looked like a child's offering. Letters were pinned to notice boards, short things that read like confessions more than poems. There was a rising sense that the town was preparing itself with the same busy tenderness a family shows when a guest is expected. Rumors migrated into the periphery of everyday life. Someone said the painting had a smell that only some could catch, like the inside of old pockets. Others said you could not touch it without remembering the thing you had lost. The rumor that stuck and grew blunt as weather was Mrs. Laurie's phrasing. It finds what still aches. People would say it like a proverb now, reverent and a little fierce. If a neighbor confessed a regret beneath their breath, someone else would respond with that phrase, and both would nod, as if they had found the right word for a wound. There are moral lines in these stories, but the one I am most interested in is closer to vanity than morality: envy. Watching a town dissolve into something gentler ignited a kind of private corrosion in me. I told myself it was compassion turned hard. Later I would name it for what it was: jealousy. Jacob hugged a woman he had been half known to love, and I wanted to break that warmth. Alice sat on the pew and sang to someone who had once been her bully, and I wanted her back at once in the cold, unresolving way that has more cruelty than justice. It is easier to hurt others in the privacy of your own grief than to admit you were unready to give what you had, only too late decided you might want to keep. There was a single night when the town's ritual felt less like a soft bath and more like something being assembled. People moved differently, with the careful attention of people who have been told there will be a test and are determined not to fail. There were lanterns placed in certain houses. Paper butterflies appeared taped to stoops and in the windows of cars. The Wickcombe boys left a ring of pebbles around an old oak, as if the ring marked a place not to be crossed without permission. Jacob came to the field with his hands empty, and when he saw me, he offered me the faintest apology. "Do you want to come?" he asked. His voice was that of a man who had found a way to trust his softness. I declined. I told myself I had work to do. I had a lecture to grade, errands to run. Jacob seemed to say what you tell someone who has made an appointment to change the subject. "Okay, I'll be here." His silhouette left the plastic glow of the lamp, and my memory of him smoothed like the back of a hand. That night, I walked the edge of the town with a flashlight that made my hands look bigger than they were. I watched as clusters of people gathered and hummed together. The hum made the air look like it had been kneaded, like something else might come out of it. I tried to tell the story to myself as a pattern, These were rituals that allowed people to say privately what they had been taught not to say publicly. But the ritual grew teeth. There were places where people left lace and bread and pins, small offerings like those left for saints. My rational mind wanted to catalogue each offering: bread for hunger, lace for memory, pins for holding something together. But the cataloguing felt like I was counting blood, and counting blood is an odd trade. I am capable of distance, but sometimes distance is a way to preserve an absence by calculation. The following week, I found a note pinned to my mailbox. It was brief, in a handwriting that seemed to me both childlike and old. "Come to the hall Thursday," it said. No name. People in Bellweather left anonymous invitations when they wanted to include everyone without singling out the shy. I tucked the note into my wallet as if it were an obligation rather than an opportunity. I thought about leaving. In old fantasies, ruined romances I had read as a boy, I imagined myself boarding a train and sitting in it blinking as the countryside made itself into a smear. It seemed possible for a week, perhaps more, to be somewhere else and become someone else. But leaving was always an action performed by someone who could believe in the possibility of starting over without consequence. I had tried to start over once. I had returned with packed boxes and no explanation for what sat like a stone in my chest. And besides, distance does not erase the ache if you carry it like a seed. It waits for an environment in which to sprout. When Thursday came, the hall was full. The painting had been moved to the front and placed on a plinth as if it were a ceremony's heart. People filed in and sat where their old rituals told them to sit. I took a seat in the back, with a grief I had negotiated into the smallness of an etiquette. Alice was there, front and center, hands resting on her knees. Jacob sat 2 rows ahead of me, with the careful posture of someone hoping there would not be a mistake. Maya came and sat closer to me than she used to. She didn't look at me with pity, but with the precise curiosity of someone trying to read a map. They began with nothing ceremonial. No words, no placards. Someone struck a chord on an old guitar, and the hum started like a current. People swayed, and the sway made sense if you had been standing in place for too long. The painting tolerated the room with the same kind of patience a tide shows to a shore. I wanted to look away, but kept finding my eyes returning to it, as if the painting had understood how to make a question and hold it in place. Afterward, in the parking lot, an old woman wrapped her arms around a man she had not seen in a dozen years. He cried against her shoulder, and she laughed in between the crying, surprised and pleased at the salt of the thing. Jacob found me in the shadow by my car and took a step closer than distance demanded. "You should have stayed," he said simply. "I needed to leave," I said. It was not a convincing answer. Even as I spoke, I felt my words flaking off, revealing the bare wall behind. I wanted to tell him everything, that I had tried to create aches the way a miser might arrange coins, that I had left flowers and apologies on porches, and nothing sank in. I wanted to confess that I feared being chosen, because being chosen meant losing a kind of sovereignty over the small, exact life I'd built. "Maybe next time," he said, and he meant it like an affirmation and not a promise. Jacob had faith that life made room for second attempts. The town, bent the way towns bend, was not done yet. There were nights after that when the rituals grew more elaborate, softer in their insistence. People did not announce an impending finale. They simply arranged themselves like a congregation. The hum became a language, and the language taught people to say things they had been risk-averse about. I watched as a man who'd spent years running the same route on his lawn saw his estranged daughter, and the 2 of them stood together in public, the father awkward, and the daughter forgiving, as if forgiveness were a right to be claimed rather than a gift. The changes were small in isolation, but monumental in the aggregate. the way individual drops can hollow a stone if persistent. And yet, I cannot disguise from you what will become the core crookedness of this story. I still felt unmoved, not because I was proud or monstrous, but because I had been careless with my capacity to ache. If ache is a muscle, then I had let mine atrophy. I would sit with people at the diner and listen to the undertow of confessions and offer sympathy measured like change, as if that would suffice. People began to offer me certain looks, curiosity in the way you look at a bird with a broken wing, equal parts waiting and pity. It was a gaze I had no way of returning. Something else began to happen that unnerved me more than the town's tender practices. People started to prepare with a kind of meticulous affection. There were lists, tasks to do before you went, someone would say later, using a word that implied going towards something, and away at once. Mrs. Laurie baked a loaf of bread and left it on the windowsill for a neighbor. A man mended the roof of a widow's shed, even though neither asked. These were not acts of desperation. They were the gestures of people who believed that whatever was coming required you to be tidy about your relationships. I tried to map this tidy reaching to psychology, to a social contagion theory, to anything that would allow me to remain an observer rather than an actor. But theories are not adequate to the shaping pull of people laying their lives back together in public. You cannot call tenderness a social phenomenon without sounding like a banker appraising charity's utility. One late night I walked past the hall and saw a line of people sitting on the curb, each with a small paper butterfly in their hands. They were folding and refolding the paper until each had its own pattern of creases. I stopped, and someone handed me one. It was simple, white, and when I held it, I felt something that registered like cool metal on the skin, familiar and alien. I folded the wings mechanically, because that is what you do when handed an object you do not understand. Keep it, someone said. It helps to hold something. I put it in my pocket and walked home. The paper did not teach me how to ache. It taught me that people were practicing the idea of being tender. Practice can be convincing. Practice can make a person gentle as a rehearsal, which is almost as dangerous as the thing itself. If the story had stayed within those tenths of change, if people had merely reconnected and left it at that, this would be the kind of small-town anecdote you bring out at a gathering to warm the room. But there was a quality to the gatherings that made them look like the hush before a tide. People began to speak of being ready, in tones that made readiness sound less like preparation and more like vocation. They left soft things in windows and wrote notes they tucked into the seams of books. The town's rituals had acquired an aim that felt like a secret kept between neighbors. I measured them and catalogued them, and still failed to translate the measurements into myself. This is where it begins to be my fault in a sharper way. I did not harm anyone deliberately. I was not cruel in an ordinary sense. But in singular moments, moments that I can replay now, as if through a glass with smudged edges, I chose clarity over risk. When Jacob asked me to stay, I left. When Alice smiled at me and offered the fragile hope of conversation, I dodged behind busy hands. When Maya reached for a confession in the kitchen and offered me the space to fail honestly, I failed neatly instead. I told the truth in measured doses that could be swallowed without disrupting anyone's appetite. If there is a sin in this story, it is an accumulation of small avoidances. You can tell yourself that avoidances are not moral failings, but they are the things that make you unfindable. You can be alive, and watchfulness can be a method to avoid being known. Once, after a night of humming and offerings, Mrs. Laurie took my wrist and squeezed. Her fingers composted my skin, like a tide turns shells. "Come to the field tomorrow," she said. "Just come. Not to see, not to be judged, but to be present." I thought of my empty pockets, and my habit of naming things so they would be safe. I thought of leaving and returning, and how responses never changed. I told her I had errands. My words were habits more than answers. She looked at me with that half smile of a person who knows you're making a choice and will not stop you, because choice is still choice, even if it keeps you from being found. She said nothing more. The night before I would have gone, had I been braver or simply kinder. There was a thing on my porch, a paper butterfly, like the ones people were folding by the curb. It was taped to my door, no note. The tape was firm but not unkind. I stared at it, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a pressure in my chest that could be called yearning if you want a gentler name. I wanted to leave the house and walk the field in which people hummed and fold and surrender the way they did. I wanted to let the ache in the place where my heart used to be a mere repository for habit. Instead, I went to bed with the paper folded into a pocket and slept the way a person sleeps when they are sure nothing will happen to them, the heavy, unready kind. In the morning, the town glowed like a place that had not pretended at contentment. People moved with a sweetness that made the light itself look like kindness. I drank coffee and watched them through a foggy window and thought about how you can be a survivor by accident and call it a miracle. I told myself I had been spared. Then the phone rang. It was Maya. Her voice, when she spoke, had a steady edge I had only heard when she was trying to get through to me in classes. "You should get down here," she said. I thought she was being melodramatic. She was not. When I reached the field, the sky was thinning toward noon, and the town had gathered in a way I had seen before, but never to this degree. People moved like congregants at a passing of some kind, orderly, reverent, each person holding a small object. A candle, a scrap of cloth, a photograph. Alice sat in the front with a smile that made her small hands look like offerings. Jacob stood near her, and his face had the acceptance of someone who has decided not to be afraid. I stood in the rear with the clipboard I had brought on reflex, though I had no reason to write anything down. The paper butterfly in my pocket felt like a lie. The hum began low, and I felt it in the soles of my feet. The town's humming made the grass look as if it had been turned to water. People looked up to the white sky the way you look up at the first light after an eclipse. I had been making choices up to that point, small ones, self-preserving. I had been claiming a kind of safety that existed only because I had kept my chest locked. If this was to be a story about ruin, that ruin had two sides, the literal and the interior. The painting, whatever it might be, had found a way to make people willing to be unmade. Mrs. Laurie's phrase fit like a key now. It finds what still aches. I don't know if the word invitation applies. Invitations are polite notes with options. This did not feel like politeness, though some would later call it kindness. It felt like an answer to an ache. It felt, in ways I did not permit myself to articulate then, like a completion. I left before the last sequence of that afternoon. I have never been able to give a good reason why. Pride inclined me to say paperwork. Cowardice inclined me to say I was obeying some old vow to be alone. The real answer is in those private moments when a person prefers to watch from the windowsill rather than step into the light with others. I chose the windowsill. When I walked back past the church hall, the painting was gone. Someone had taken it down and wrapped it in linen. People were moving with a gravity that suggested something else had begun. I heard a laugh, not the nervous kind, but one saturated with release. I heard people calling one another's names like blessings. I sat on the steps of my house and watched the town perform itself into a different geometry. They were more beautiful than you could have expected, and I thought in that ugly way some people do. They were more deserving than I had given them credit for. Then I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, a small sting, and I realized with a clarity that felt like a clean cut that what I had been practicing all along, distance, calculation, tidy apologies, was the reason I had been spared the other possibility. Surviving in that moment had the flavor of a coin dropped on hard floor. It sounded like luck and felt like loss. I could have closed the door on the image, locked my remaining measures of safety, and gone on with the life of someone unmarked. Instead, I sat there with the paper butterfly folded in my hand and watched them go on gathering. I think even then, that part of me wanted to see what they were becoming. I wanted to confirm that the ache they yielded to was real. I wanted to know if the cost of being found would be paid in quiet relief. That is where I will leave it for now. At the edge of a decision I did not make, with the town kneading itself into tenderness, and me, the observer, keeping my hands in my pockets and folding paper into the small shape of wings. The air smelled of rain that had not yet come. The hum rose like a tide. The paper in my palm twitched as if it might take off on its own. The paper in my palm twitched as if it had its own small heart. For a moment I believed it might lift, flit from my fingers, and join the others like a skittish bird recalled. It did not. The hum thickened. The field was a low bowl of people. All faces turned the same way, and the sound they made was a single instrument tuned to patience. I could have walked away. I had chosen the windowsill many times in my life, chosen the quiet comforts of alignment with furniture and list-making over the raw currency of other people. The house on the slope looked like a place that had never been asked anything, and I had liked that about it, its loyalty to brick and habit. But the hum, the way it shook the soil, made my shoes feel precarious. My hand closed around the folded paper until the creases made small ridges in my skin. Then something pointed and small as a bell rang in the air, the sound of someone giving a direction that could not be obeyed in halves. A hush below the hum settled like dust. Alice at the front raised her hand. Her face was not the pale confusion of adolescence, but the attentiveness of someone who had been instructed in the grammar of surrender. I saw Jacob reach for a pocket, and then stop, as if the action itself were now an imposition on what had begun. Light withdrew. Not the cinematic kind of dimming that theaters invent for effect, but the stripping of the day to a thinner fabric, as if the sky itself had been folded and smoothed. People leaned forward, as if the shift required them to be more present than their bodies alone could manage. Mrs. Laurie's head was tilted like an old radio, catching a distant station. Her eyes were bright as if the hum had made them clean. I tell this as someone who has long since learned that the crucial moments of a life are often small, domestic gestures. Nothing announced the change beyond a tightening of the street sounds. The gulls fell silent. The parking lot's crickets paused. The humming thinned into a tone that seemed to be a name, and the canvas at the hall, that white, ridiculous, impossible canvas, hung somewhere between presence and memory. I could not see the painting from where I sat, but I could feel its shape as if it were pressed to the inside of my chest. Then the first thing happened. It was not a violence. It was a kind of unzipping, a soundless loosening. A woman near the lamp, someone who had hung a photograph around her neck that showed a boy at the harbor, slid her hand from his shoulder and smiled with her whole face, the way sleep returns upon waking. Her skin seemed to loosen at the edges, like cloth coming adrift from a seam. It was not collapse, it was unmaking with a purpose. Ribbons of light uncurled along her forearm, and she bowed her head as if to let the sun pull something out of her. I do not want to gild what happened with poetical bulwarks. The description must be honest and not translational. Flesh separated from the idea of itself in a manner at once tender and clinical. Limbs did not flail. They peeled with a tissue-like slowness. It was as if someone had taught bodies how to take off their skins like gloves. The people did not scream. I say this because later, when asked, I could not give anyone the kind of answer those two syllables might imply. There was surprise, an intake of breath, and then a startling relief that made faces fall into a softness I had not known was possible for a human expression. Alice's hands, those thin-mapped hands, unfettered themselves and fell away from her own wrists as if she had simply completed a knot. She closed her eyes and smiled, like someone who has been forgiven beyond merit. Jacob's mouth, always held like a promise yet to be made, opened and released a sound that might have been a laugh or prayer, and could have been both. The Whitcomb boys, who had once hurled rocks for sport, sat very still and then laid their heads back and let whatever held them unbind. Nathan, the postmaster, did not make the precise gestures of his ledger that had been his armor. His shoulders collapsed into a posture that looked to me like a surrender I had misread as stubbornness for years. The dismantling had texture and pattern. It was peel, not rupture. It was as if the skin of being human had been invented in layers that, when allowed, could be drawn apart like the petals of a closed flower. You could see the habit of a life in the way a person released themselves. Mrs. Laurie's hands, always so precise, came away like the last clippings on a roast, cleaned and content. The man from the hardware store unlatched his jaw, the way one might unlatch a gate. The librarian folded like paper into the light. And then came the dust. Not the choking, filthy kind you sweep from floorboards, but an immaculate ash that smelled faintly of wood smoke and lavender, and the undercoat of peach jam. It rose like a hymn, and took with it the shapes that once mapped the town's love and hurt. For a heartbeat, I thought of church candles going out, one by one, but there was no darkness, only a shifting of luminescence. The ash floated upward and consolidated, and from the gathered memory of hands and voices, something winged formed. I had imagined, ridiculously, that the presence it made would be a modest chimera, some patchwork of paper wings and glue. The thing that rose was larger than the town hall, wider than the sycamore in the park. It was an architecture of relationships, of apologies and returned calls, of bread placed on windowsills, and the particular way a woman in Bellweather had hummed to herself while shelling peas. It held the faces of those it had been made from, as if they were panels in a stained glass window, translucent and intact within the structure, but no longer bound by the small geometry of a life. The wings were latticed with the color of 100 little reconciliations, blue and the pale gold of sun on salted roofs. It was luminous and non-human, terrifying in its beauty, because it had the look of something that was not asking permission. For a moment it oriented itself, like a bird testing wind. It rose, and then it moved with the inevitability of a tide over the town's layout. It passed above the field, and the church, and the rows of houses. It brushed the roofs with a grace that might have been blessing if I did not understand the thing's making as an erasure. People who had been whole and warm were now the constituent elements of that creature's wing. Those faces reappeared in patterns of light as the thing folded itself into direction. It did not roar. It sighed in the way a congregation might exhale after Mass. I watched, and feeling left me like a coat shed on a stake. The creature's passage over my neighborhood coated everything in that immaculate ash. It moved with deliberation, like an animal deciding which branches to alight on. When it passed over me, I did not feel the warmth of a hand, but the precise removal of weight. My hair stung with dust, my eyelashes glistened. The sensation was cold and strangely sanitary. Clothes powdered with what looked like the residue of bonfires gone gentle. The skin on my arms felt powdered, as if the world itself had sifted. It did not look at me the way a human might look at another human, for its sight, if it had sight, was the aggregate of 100 small intimacies. It slid over my house and the field, and then it rose toward the harbor, where gulls lifted as if summoned. When it passed above the water, its wings caught and refracted a light like stained glass, and for a suspended, harrowing second, I understood that the town had not been annihilated, but remade into a single impossible being. The winged thing turned then, toward the horizon and lifted, carrying with it the tender matter of our lives. I stood in the street, hands still curled around the paper butterfly, and felt suddenly, as I had never before, the precise scale of my survival. The ash that had come down like a faint snowfall clung to the lambency of my skin. It covered my eyelashes and caked the inside of my shoes. People around me, those who had not been at the field or in the hall, the sleepy late-shift barista, the resident who had not left their home that day, were similarly dusted. They moved with a stunned curiosity at their hands. "Did they?" someone whispered. There was a softness in that whisper that made me want to answer for us all, and answer I could not. In the hours that followed, the town's geometry was altered in ways a map could not account for. Houses stood where they had stood, but a tenderness had been harvested from them, some seed taken. The field was littered with offerings, candles not fully spent, ribbons, paper butterflies half trampled into the grass. The church hall, the thin belly where once a painting had hung between a hayfield and a watercolor, was an empty room with a pedestal on which the canvas had lain and then been removed. No one could say who had taken the painting. Some said it had never been there. Others said it had been wrapped and taken to a place where gentle things are kept. They called it an ascension. I have never liked the word. It smells to me of tidy explanations. The newspapers used it, neighbors used it, and visitors who came with notebooks and cameras used it. Later there would be debates about semantics and origin and ethics. Right then, in the hour after the flight, the word people used in the street was simpler and slotted toward the truth. Gone, gone with a quiet that felt like relief. People walked the sidewalks with hands wrapped around one another and talked in the small sentences of those learning to be found by a world that had altered their capacity to be loved. I remember Jacob's mother coming to my door the day after and embracing me without ceremony. She smelled of the peach jam and tears and said, "He was laughing at nothing, and then he was a light." I could not say that I was glad for her. I could not say anything that would not sound false. Her hands were knuckles of grief, and she wanted to place them in my hands as if by contact compensation could be made. None of us in those first days was exempt from a kind of public bewilderment. They told me I had been spared. Some blessed me with that word, spared, like it was a favor received. Others held me as if I had been an accident, one step from the cliff. The lines people said to me became a chorus of confessions. "How are you?" a woman asked, and all I could hear in that question was an inventory of things I had not done. The sheriff knocked at my door with the tenderness of a man who had been handed a ledger he did not know how to balance. He had ash on his collar and a look in his eyes that suggested he had been given a miracle, in the way miracles sometimes arrive, flat and not quite true. He told me carefully that aid teams were trying to reach everyone. He said their first priority was the fragile survivors, infants, the elderly. I could hear how the sentence had been rehearsed in his mouth and how inadequate it felt. Days later, when the first teams came with their instruments and tape and competent grey vests, they asked me to come down to the field. The site was cordoned off in the polite bureaucratic way. Bodies are respected after a change that does not obey human law. The field was an uncanny archaeology of tenderness, candles guttered, notes caught in the grass, a child's paper butterfly stuck to the curve of the ground. People walked with expressions of private evaluation. Some people tried to catalogue the moments, to find patterns that explained what had become inexplicable. In the days that followed, I could not sleep. You would think exhaustion might set in, that the arc of sleeplessness would flatten the mind. Instead, I ran measures and intervals, as if calculation could make me useful. I walked houses that had been near the field and offered to help where I could. I delivered casseroles with an awkwardness that made recipients laugh. Those acts, those small offerings, felt like rehearsals for something I did not want to rehearse. I had no theology for myself, beyond the clarity that my survival had the texture of an omission. The visits to the hospital came inevitable as calendars. I was examined by some people who used words like shock and trauma and spectrum of response. Therapists came to sit with me in avenues of conversation, asking me to name my feelings and rate them. I found I was able to describe the world with clinical precision, but unable to register the ache that supposedly made one eligible for being found. Maya visited me in the hospital once, a thermos of coffee in hand, and she looked at me with an expression that was not pity so much as study. "You were not found because you lacked the ache," she said finally, and her tone was not cruel. "You were found because you had the wrong kind of storage. You hoarded feeling where it should have been buried." She had been learning new languages to speak to what had happened, and sometimes they worked, and sometimes they rattled. "Do you think it's better?" I asked, aware of the smallness of the question. "To be found, or to not be found?" Maya did not answer immediately. She wound the lid of the thermos back on, like someone tucking in a child. "I don't know," she said. "I know it's different. People who were found are not people you pity. They're luminous. They're not less. They are other. But the loss for the ones left is not small. You have to decide what to do with that." Her words were precise, because she did not want me to confuse morality for explanation. There were those who told me the thing had been merciful. They would appear on my porch, someone's cousin, a reporter, a woman with a scarf, and look meaningfully at the scar of ash on my hands and declare that mercy had moved through Bellweather. Others called it a robbery, an erasure with a sweet coat. I could hear the moralizing in both versions, and none fit what I felt, which was an ache that was more akin to corrosion. The ruin left in me was not flourished by heaven, nor taught by nature. It was the specific and private sort of destruction that comes from comprehension of your own cowardice. You can tell it however you want, call it guilt, call it envy, but the central fact was obstinate. I watched people I had known all my life be reconfigured into something beautiful and left with their physical absence and the knowledge that I had refused them an act of openness. Their removal did not diminish them. If anything, it made them luminous in the precise way absence does. Absence sets the remaining thing in relief. But this relief was a violence toward me, and I could not find a language to make it charitable. There were practical things to do. The mayor set up committees to attend to property questions, to the stewardship of photographs and keepsakes. A registry was made of items left in the field. Lights were lit in memory. The people who had been taken, if taken is the right verb, were mourned like one might mourn a town river, polluted and then purified. Services were held in the church hall and in the open field. The clergy offered words that were careful and without doctrinal force. They said, "We give what we can." That line was sufficient for many and inadequate for others. I became a presence in those services, more out of practical guilt than piety. I would sit at the back and watch, and sometimes I would see the faces that had been made into wings in the winged thing reflected in people's expressions. People tried to speak with me, neighbors if not friends, and I would nod and give them measured sympathy. In private, when the visitor left and the porch light clicked off, I would stand with my hands empty and watch my own capacity for wanting. Desire, I learned, has a cost. To truly want something is to make yourself vulnerable to its removal. Sometimes I would walk to the harbor at dawn and watch gulls stitch themselves across the water. The winged thing, if the stories were true, had flown beyond the horizon. People speculated where it had gone, out to sea, up the stream of air toward some place that could digest such things. Others said it had disintegrated somewhere uncanny. There were photographs taken by tourists of a strange flaring over the water, but the images were grainy and unsatisfying. the way photographs are when they try to hold what the world cannot be taught to contain. My nights were the worst. Sleep came in short, shallow blocks. I would dream not of the winged thing, but of small domestic scenes that could have sufficed had I not made them fail. Jacob showing me a photograph of his childhood dog, Alice laughing at something in a library book, Maya arguing a point with enthusiastic hands. In the dreams I reached and always found the hands of a person who was no longer there, or who had been there and was now a panel of stained glass humming in the sky. The town's survivors, those who had not been chosen, clustered in new ways. There were support groups that formed around coffee pots, and people came with notes and photographs, and the small rituals of grieving. They would hold each other's hands and say the names of the missing aloud, until the saying of names made the empty places in our mouths seem for a moment less sharp. I attended some of these meetings, but I was clumsy in rituals of mutual care. The thing I lacked, if ache is a muscle, was not only the ability to feel, but the knowledge of how to practice that feeling, without turning it into a private commodity. One person, a retired schoolteacher named Ellen, whose husband had been part of the Wings, confronted me in a way that later I would understand as both grace and accusation. She came up behind me during a town meeting, put her palm on my shoulder, with the simple confidence of someone who had been used to touching people in order to steady them, and said, "Do something for them, Aaron, not for pity, for the sake of what you didn't give." Her voice was not loud, but it cut cleanly. Make something of your survival besides walling yourself in. I left that meeting and went home and tried to do something small. I sorted the photographs people had left at the hall. I helped place names in a small concrete registry that would hold the presence of the lost like pebbles in a jar. There was comfort in that work because it had a task orientation. There is always charity in tasks. You can do them without exposing the nakedness that we call need. News crews came as they do, with their lenses and their appetite for sentences one can clip and repeat. They asked me to describe what it was like to be spared. I told them what I could. Words, however, have limits. I could not map the political geometry of my own cowardice. I could describe, clinically, the way the ash felt, but I could not, then or later, articulate the specific arithmetic of choices that had led me to be the one with intact personhood, in a town whose tenderness had been consumed to form something beautiful and other. People sent letters. Some of these letters were kind, others were more complicated. A woman wrote to me from the city and told me, with a sharpness that suggested a holiness she had not earned, that sparing was a sign. "You were spared for a reason," she wrote. Another letter was from a former neighbor whose brother had been among the Wings. It said in one line, "We don't want you to be ashamed, but we want you to change. Would change help?" I took up small attempts. I learned to listen with attention. I tried clumsily to let a conversation be more than a performance. To Maya I confessed, in awkward sittings over burnt coffee, my embarrassments and my strategies for protecting my chest. She listened as she always had, without derision, only curiosity, and then she said, "You can't plan tenderness. You can only invite it and risk being altered by it." There were days when the envy returned, like a tide punching at a sandbar. I would see a woman in the market whose hair had turned silver in a way that made the light look like it had been rearranged by memory, and my stomach would hollow with wanting. It was not merely the desire to die, it was the desire to have been an instrument in someone's joy. To be made into a wing was not, I began to see, a simple erasure. The people who became part of the winged thing were not annihilated in a nihilistic manner. Their faces, as preserved in the creature's panels, expressed a kind of release that was not cruelty. To the contrary, they looked, one would be tempted to say, less burdened. This is the most bitter part. Their ruin, if you insist on the word, was not as ruin is usually imagined. The ruin of the town was the physical alteration of lives into a single luminous thing. The ruin of me was internal and quieter, but equally absolute. Their bodies became a different order of being. My life became a ledger of missed opportunities. There is a temptation in confessions to inflate your suffering to match what was taken. I will not do that. They were gone. Their absence shaped the town, like a missing tooth shapes a face. But my suffering was real and distinct. Survivor's guilt is a precise instrument. It eats the edges of things. You want to trade places with them, but your longing becomes an accusation against yourself. Months passed. The winged thing remained rumor and sky. People reported seeing glances of it over distant hills, a refraction over the sea. The field healed in a hushed way. Grass grew back thicker where it had been trod. The town came to negotiate its loss with the same routines it had once used to avoid discomfort. There were anniversaries, and the town withheld the kind of triumphant rhetoric that might have made the absence into a sermon. We did not hold a celebratory parade. We held quiet gatherings. Candles were lit. People read passages from books and left paper butterflies in jars, as if each folded wing could contain a memory. Friends of the missing gathered to tell stories. They told of small things: a laugh, a habit of tucking unstuck corners of napkins, a favorite song sung under the hum of a dryer. The telling of stories made the missing present in a way that the winged thing's flight could not wholly accomplish. People who had been part of the wing came back in the way they had been before, in other people's speech and in household objects that retained a faint aura of the one who had used them. It was a different kind of survival. For me, rehabilitation was a different economy. The hospital offered programs, groups for those who had witnessed collective trauma, workshops on compassion, recommended readings by people who study loss. I attended and found that academic language often bulldozed over the simplicity of sorrow. They taught grounding exercises. They taught me to list 5 things I could see at any moment to anchor myself. I practiced and often felt nothing but the awareness of the list's inadequacy. People who lost loved ones sometimes sought punitive explanations. They asked whether the painting had targeted those who were ready for repair. They asked whether the winged thing had been merciful. I kept hearing Mrs. Laurie's clear small sentence: "It finds what still aches." That sentence had the geometry of an explanation without being an explanation. It clarified that the phenomenon did not choose at random, but responded to interior configurations. But it also offered no solace. If it found what ached, then perhaps my achelessness was the cost of survival, a trade I had cut myself into by choosing timidity over risk. The town put together a small committee to preserve memory and to decide whether to reopen the hall to shows. There were debates about whether art should be tethered to that wall again, whether a painting might once more do what the Blue Wing had done. The mayor, with that polite mix of pragmatism and sentiment common to small towns, advised caution. "We celebrate the people we miss," he said. "We don't have to invite risk again to do that." In quiet, some questioned whether the winged thing might ever return. Some said it had not left the region at all, but simply moved like a migrating bird to a new place of readiness. Others thought it had found its destination. The uncertainty hung in the air like the